In this segment, I'd like to describe the table spellout rules in the synthesizing grammar a bit more. In the previous segment, we generated nouns 1-1, and the final result was a man walked, and we saved it. So let's go to the next verse. And the next verse produces some men walked. Here, if we look at the features under man, we see that the number is plural and participant tracking is first mention. So we need to write a rule that will select the plural form of a noun from the lexicon whenever the number is plural. We could do that using Grammar Wizard, but I'd like to do that myself. I'm going to double click on nouns and we'll enter a new group name. Let's call it number. Then I'll double click on number, and here's an empty spellout rule. This will be a form selection rule, and it will select the plural form of nouns whenever the noun's number is plural. Now while we're here, I'm going to select dual, trial, quadrial, pockle, and plural. In a subsequent tutorial, we'll talk about the transfer grammar, and the transfer grammar has a certain type of rule called feature collapsing rules. And there we can collapse, we'll write one rule that will collapse dual, trial, quadrial to plural, because English doesn't morphologically distinguish these values. But we haven't talked about the transfer grammar yet, so I'm going to select all of these values for now. And let's give this rule a name. Select the plural form from the lexicon whenever number is plural. And we should always assign each rule to at least one grammar topic. Let's select number. Okay, now if we click the generate button, we'll see men walked. And if we rest the cursor on men, we'll see that man was changed to men by the spellout rule that we just wrote. So now we need to insert the plural indefinite article some. In an earlier segment, we worked on this rule, which adds the singular indefinite article a. I'd like to do this with a table rule. We could write another simple rule, but since these rules are related to one another, let's turn this rule off. Whenever a rule is turned off, you see the word off. And now let's write a table rule. This will be a table rule. It will add words. In English, these articles are separate words. And let's set up our table so that the first column is for singular. And then we'll add another column. We'll call it plural, but again I'm going to check all of these values. When we rest the cursor here, you can see that the noun number can be dual or trial or quadrial or pockle or plural. Let's call this first mention. You'll see why I'm setting up the table this way soon. Here we'll enter the singular indefinite article a and the plural indefinite article some. Every table spellout rule can have multiple layers, up to 100 layers. This table rule will eventually have 2 layers. Let's call this layer articles. We need to supply a tag. Let's call the tag, we'll call that article as well. Let's select some grammar topics, participant tracking, and number. And while we're here, if we right-click on a cell, the comment field goes blank, and we can enter the comment for that particular cell. So that one was for nouns 1-1, a man walked. And then push the enter key. And now if we rest the cursor there, we see the pop-up, a man walked. Let's right-click on this cell, and we'll enter nouns 1-2. Some men walked. This comment, we don't need this comment. Let's give this rule a name. Eventually this rule will do more than insert articles, but for now that's a fine name. Okay, so let's click initialize and generate. Some men walked. And we rest our cursor here, and we see that it was inserted by a spellout rule for nouns. The group is articles. The rule's name is insert articles, and it was layer 1, which is called articles, row 1, which is called first mention, and column 2, which is called plural. Let's save this verse and go on to the next verse, which produces the man walked. The number here is singular, and participant tracking is now routine. So let's go back here and let's add a row called routine. So when participant tracking is routine, if the noun is singular, we add the. If the noun is plural, we also add the. Let's right click on this cell and it'll be nouns 1, 3. The man walked. And if we generate the verse now, we see the man walked, which is the proper form. Let's save it. If we go to the next verse, this one produces no man walked. That has some complications, so let's skip this one and go to this verse, which is this man walked. And the reason it produces this is because proximity is near speaker and listener. The number is singular and participant tracking is routine, but now proximity is near speaker and listener. So let's modify this rule. We're going to add a layer. So we click Add Layer, and this layer will be called Proximity. Let's set up our table so that the first column is singular, and again we'll add a column. It'll be called plural, but we'll select all of these. Okay, this value is near speaker and listener. We're going to call it proximal, and we'll select this value, near speaker and listener. And English inserts this when it's singular, and these when it's plural. Let's right click on that cell and we'll enter nouns 1, 1, 5. This man walked. And now let's add one more topic, and that will be proximity. If we click the generate button now, we see this man walked, which is the proper surface form, so let's save it. Let's go to the next verse, which also produces this man walked, but it's different. This time proximity is near speaker. So all we have to do is go to this layer of the table and also select near speaker. English lumps these together. If we click generate, we get this man walked, which is again the proper form. So we save it. Let's go to the next verse, which produces that man walked. If we look here, proximity is near listener. So let's go back to our table rule, go to layer 2. Okay, this is near listener. Let's add another row. We're going to call it distal. And we'll select near listener. English inserts that and those. Let's right click on this cell, nouns 1, 7. That man walked. If we click the generate button, the rules are executed. That man walked, so we get the proper surface form. This one also produces that man walked, but now we see that proximity is remote within sight. All we have to do is go back, go to layer 2, under distal, select remote within sight. And now we rest our cursor there and we see that it applies to both near listener or remote within sight. Click the generate button and the rules are executed. That man walked. That's the proper form, so we save it. Go to the next verse, which also produces that man walked. This time its proximity is remote out of sight. So if we go here, double click, add remote out of sight. I'd like to mention while we're here, when these table rules are executed, TBTA begins with the last layer, and it looks for a cell where all the features match. It'll check the rows. If a row's features matches, then it will start checking the columns one by one. Whenever it finds a cell that matches, it will remember that cell. And whenever it finds a cell in a particular layer that matches, it'll use that cell. If no cell in a particular layer matches, then it will move to a preceding layer. Okay, so it begins with the back layer. That's the main thing to remember. So here we get that man walked. Let's save it. If we go to the next verse, okay, this year a man walked. If we looked at year, it's temporally near. Let's begin by linking year, the concept year, to the target language equivalent. Let's say new target stem, year. Year is neuter. That's the correct plural form, year. Okay, so now the concept year is linked to the target language equivalent. Okay, for this year, its proximity is temporally near. So let's go back here. We want this marker, so let's add temporally near. If we click the generate button, the rules are executed, and we get a man walked this year. We won't go into the details of moving this year to the front. It's marked as a significant time. If you look at participant status, you'll see significant time, and English tends to front those. We won't deal with that right now. Next verse, okay, that year a man walked. If we look at proximity, it's temporally remote. So go back here. We want the distal value, so temporally remote. The rules are executed. A man walked that year. That's fine for now. Save it. Go to the next verse. This verse produces this man walked, and the proximity here is contextually near with focus. In other words, he's not physically near. He's not near the speaker or listener or remote with insight, anything like that. He's just on the discourse stage. He's contextually near with focus. And again, we'll use this one, contextually near with focus. If we click the generate button, the rules are executed. This man walked. Go to the next verse. This will be the last one. That man walked. Here, proximity is contextually near. So we'll add contextually near. And we get that man walked. Now I'd like to show you one more thing. After you've generated a series of verses and you've been modifying your grammar, it's always a good idea to come over here where you can generate multiple verses. Let's tell it to generate nouns 1.1 to nouns 1.13. It's set up, our target language name in this case is demo. So when we click the generate button, it will show the saved verse and then the newly generated verse and show us if anything has been changed. So let's click generate. It shows us the saved text, a man walked, and the newly generated text is a man walked. And they're the same. Whenever something isn't the same, it appears in red. For example, right here, we skipped this verse. That should be generating nouns 1.4 is no man walked. But it's always a good idea to come back here and check your verses. And when it's done, it will show you just the verses that have differences, in this case nouns 1.4. And that concludes this segment.